They laughed at her torn pink dress, until the Millionaire CEO walked onto the dance floor and changed everything. The school auditorium was alive with the smells of floor polish and the faint sweetness of tangerines, the kind of scent that lingered from the morning when parents had helped set up for the dance. Paper garlands hung unevenly along the walls, swaying slightly each time the heavy doors opened, and a DJ in the corner tapped nervously at his playlist, trying to time each song just right. Groups of first graders clustered around the long refreshment table, chattering loudly as they grabbed cups of juice and cookies, while others giggled near the stage, their voices mixing with the faint hum of anticipation in the air. Against the far wall, away from the swirl of movement and laughter, stood 6-year-old Sophie Carter, her hands clinging to the frayed hem of her pink dress. Once, the dress might have been considered special, with its simple lines and gentle folds, but now it was faded from countless washes, dotted with tiny holes near the seams, and marred by a stubborn stain on the collar that no soap could remove. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a bun that her mother had fixed earlier that day with careful hands, though her mother's strength had been limited. Sophie's large blue eyes held a quiet determination. She had promised herself she would not cry tonight, no matter what. Around her, whispers floated just loud enough for her to hear. A group of children cast glances in her direction before turning away in exaggerated disinterest, their words coated with cruelty that they didn't yet understand could wound deeply. "I'm not dancing with her," one boy muttered with a smirk, "that dress looks like it came from the trash." The word stung, though Sophie kept her posture still, as if her stillness could make her invisible. She pressed her small palms against her chest, as though holding her heart in place could keep the tears from coming. Her mind wandered briefly to home, to the small bedroom she shared with her mother, to the gentle voice that used to read her bedtime stories every night before illness had taken hold. Her mother, Megan, had done everything she could to make this evening special, braiding her hair in the morning, fastening the bun with a ribbon, smoothing the wrinkles from the only dress they had for such occasions, but she could not be here tonight. Megan had been too unwell to leave bed for more than a few minutes at a time, and there had been no money for something new to wear. Sophie told herself the dress was fine, that it didn't matter, but the echo of laughter from nearby tables told her the world didn't agree. The double doors at the back of the hall opened again, letting in a burst of cool evening air. A group of adults entered, school patrons and guests, dressed in suits and elegant dresses, their shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Among them was a tall man whose presence seemed to command the room without him trying. His light blue suit contrasted with the deep brown of his neatly styled hair, and his clear blue eyes scanned the hall with calm assurance. He greeted the principal with a polite nod, but as he turned his head, his gaze stopped on Sophie. In the swirl of music, laughter, and restless shuffling, there was a momentary stillness, as though the hum of the room had shifted. Sophie noticed the look, though she didn't yet understand why it felt different from the glances she had grown used to. The man's expression held neither pity nor curiosity, it was something else entirely, something she couldn't name but that made her stand a little straighter without realizing it. Michael Reed had attended dozens of school events in his life as part of his company's community outreach programs, but he had never felt compelled to change course in the middle of a conversation the way he did now. As the principal continued to thank him for the foundation's recent grant, his mind was no longer on the rehearsed pleasantries or the expected remarks about the importance of education. His attention was fixed entirely on the little girl standing alone near the far wall, her small frame wrapped in a faded pink dress that seemed to hold more history than fabric. There was a stillness about her, not the relaxed kind but the kind born from trying to become invisible. He had seen similar postures before, in boardrooms when junior staff tried not to be noticed, in shelters where children waited for their turn in line. Yet here, at what was supposed to be a joyful event, that quiet attempt to vanish felt especially out of place. He excused himself from the principal with a polite smile, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who was used to commanding a room, though his purpose was different tonight. A few children noticed him passing and stared at the light blue suit and polished shoes, some whispering to one another, but he paid them no mind. When he reached Sophie, he slowed his pace, lowering his posture slightly so that he wouldn't tower over her. Up close, the details of the dress became clearer, the frayed edges near the cuffs, the small hand-sewn repairs at the hem, the stain near the collar that had resisted every attempt to hide it. He also saw the way her fingers gripped the fabric, knuckles pale from the pressure, as though holding onto the dress itself was her only anchor. May I have this dance? His voice was calm, almost casual, but his eyes held a quiet insistence that made it impossible to dismiss the invitation as politeness. Sophie's head lifted, her blue eyes locking onto his with an expression that was equal parts confusion and disbelief. Around them, the laughter that had filled the room moments earlier faltered. A boy near the refreshment table muttered something to his friend, who stifled a laugh, but neither of them dared speak louder. Michael extended his hand without glancing away from her, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if this simple act had unsettled an unspoken rule. Sophie hesitated, glancing toward the group of classmates who were now watching openly. She seemed to weigh something in her mind before finally releasing the hem of her dress and placing her small hand into his. Her palm was warm but slightly trembling, the way a bird's might feel when caught and held too gently to struggle. Michael led her toward the center of the floor, where the DJ, clearly uncertain of what was happening, fumbled with the playlist before letting the current waltz continue to play. As they began to move, Michael kept his steps slow and measured, adjusting his stride so that Sophie didn't have to strain to match him. At first, she kept her gaze lowered, watching her feet as though afraid of misstepping, but gradually she glanced up, curiosity softening the tightness in her expression. Her bun swayed slightly as they turned, and the skirt of her dress, though thin, caught a ripple of movement that made it seem momentarily lighter, as if the years worn into its fabric didn't matter. Around them, whispers shifted in tone. Some of the children's faces showed confusion, others a dawning awareness that this was not the kind of moment they could make fun of without looking foolish. By the time the song ended, Sophie's grip on his hand had eased. Michael gave a small bow, and she returned it with the faintest hint of a smile, small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, but to him, it was the most important change in the room. He escorted her back to her seat near the wall, but instead of leaving immediately, he pulled a chair beside hers and sat down. The noise of the dance resumed around them, but a subtle shift had taken place. Those who had laughed earlier now kept their distance, uncertain of how to resume their mockery without it feeling out of place. Sophie sat a little straighter, not because her dress had changed or because the room was suddenly kinder, but because someone had chosen to stand, no, dance, beside her when no one else would. Michael didn't leave her side right away. Instead, he leaned slightly forward in his chair so their voices could be heard over the music without forcing Sophie to speak too loudly. He asked her simple questions at first, whether she liked school, if she enjoyed dancing, and what she usually did for fun. Her answers were short and cautious, as though she was measuring how much she could safely reveal to someone she had just met. Gradually, however, her words became a little more open. She told him that her favorite subject was art because she could make something out of nothing, and that she liked dancing even though she didn't get much chance to do it. She spoke about her mother in a way that mixed pride with worry, describing how kind she was and how she always tried to smile even when she was tired. When Michael mentioned the dress, complimenting how carefully it had been kept, Sophie looked down and ran her fingers along the hem. She explained that it was her mother's favorite, even though they had found it in a second-hand shop a long time ago. It was special because her mother had told her it was beautiful no matter what other people said. As she smoothed the skirt, Michael's eyes caught something unusual on the inside of the fabric where the hem folded. There, almost hidden, were tiny embroidered shapes, small birds stitched with such precision and individuality that he knew instantly they hadn't been made by a factory machine. Each one was slightly different from the other, the kind of handwork that carried both skill and affection. A sudden wave of recognition hit him. These birds were exactly like the ones his late sister, Grace, used to sew into the clothes she made for children in their neighborhood when they were younger. Grace had called them her lucky birds, saying they were meant to remind anyone who wore them that they had wings, even if they couldn't see them yet. Michael remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager, watching her work by the soft glow of the lamp, her fingers moving quickly while she told him stories about the children she was sewing for. It had been years since he'd thought about those evenings, but now it was as if the years between had collapsed into this one moment. "May I take a closer look at the seam?" he asked, his voice careful not to startle her. Sophie nodded and gently lifted the edge of the dress so he could see. He turned the fabric over and found, next to one of the birds, faint embroidered initials, GR. The stitches were worn and faded, but they were unmistakable. He felt a tightening in his chest, a realization forming that connected his past to this child in a way he hadn't anticipated. Grace R., his sister's name, Grace Reed. This dress had once passed through his sister's hands, carrying her mark, her care, and now it belonged to this little girl sitting quietly beside him in a room full of people who had ignored her until moments ago. Michael didn't say anything right away. He didn't want to overwhelm her with the story of how he knew the dress, nor did he want to make the moment about his own memories. But something in him shifted as he sat there, watching Sophie's small hands fold the skirt back into place. This wasn't just a chance meeting at a school dance anymore. The fact that she wore something touched by his sister's kindness felt like a thread pulling him toward a responsibility he hadn't been looking for but could no longer ignore. He knew then that whatever this connection meant, it was not something he could walk away from. The following afternoon Michael found himself standing in front of a modest 3-story apartment building on the quieter side of town. It was the kind of place where the paint on the railings had long since begun to peel and the mailboxes carried layers of tape from years of quick repairs. He hadn't announced his visit in advance. Part of him worried that if he gave himself too much time to think, he might overcomplicate something that needed to be simple. He climbed the narrow stairwell, the scent of cooking mixed faintly with the medicinal sharpness of antiseptic lingering in the air, until he reached the door with the number Sophie had quietly told him the night before. When Megan Carter opened the door, she looked smaller than he expected. Her frame was delicate, almost fragile, her face pale in a way that suggested more than just fatigue, but her eyes, clear and light like Sophie's, held a guarded warmth. She hesitated when she saw him, her hand tightening on the edge of the door, clearly unsure why a man in a tailored light blue suit was standing in her hallway. Sophie's voice floated from somewhere inside, calling out to ask who was there. Megan stepped aside cautiously, and Michael entered, finding himself in a small but tidy living room where every object seemed to have a purpose. Sophie appeared a moment later, her hair loose now and falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She was holding the pink dress draped over her arms like a precious relic. "I wanted to show him the birdies," she told her mother with the kind of earnestness only a child could have. Megan glanced at the dress and then at Michael, a flicker of confusion crossing her face as she tried to make sense of his interest. They all sat down, and over the next several minutes Megan explained, with quiet matter-of-factness, how she had found the dress in a box of heavily discounted clothes at a thrift store. She said she hadn't noticed the embroidery until later, and by then the dress had already become Sophie's favorite. It didn't take long for Michael to hear what wasn't being said. Megan spoke about her illness in understated terms, avoiding details, but the signs were everywhere: the careful way she shifted in her seat to avoid strain, the thinness in her wrists, the faint shadows beneath her eyes. There was no self-pity in her voice, only the plain reality of trying to keep life steady for her daughter when so much of it rested on fragile foundations. She admitted she hadn't been able to work much lately and that bills piled up faster than she could manage. She said it all without complaint, as if rehearsed from having to explain it before, but Michael could feel the weight behind her words. When he told her about Grace, the sister who used to sew little bird stitches into clothes for children who couldn't afford new ones, something shifted in the room. Megan's expression softened into a smile tinged with surprise, as though a tiny light had been switched on in a dim corner. She ran her fingers lightly over the hem of the dress, tracing one of the stitches. "Then it's even more special than I thought," she said quietly, almost to herself. Sophie leaned against her mother's side, listening but not fully grasping the history they were speaking of, only sensing that it meant the dress had a story beyond her own. Michael stayed longer than he had planned. He asked Megan about Sophie's school, her interests, her friends, and each answer painted a clearer picture of the girl who had stood so still against the wall the night before. By the time he left, the sun was low, casting a warm, amber light through the narrow hallway. As he stepped outside, he realized that meeting Sophie had stirred something more personal than the charity events and sponsorships his company often managed. This wasn't about writing a check or funding a program from a distance. This was about a specific child, a specific family, and a shared thread from his past that tied him directly to them. The decision formed in his mind as naturally as breathing: he was going to help them, and not just once, but in a way that would change the course they were on. Michael began his plans the very next morning, sitting at his kitchen table long before the city had fully awakened. The early light cast pale blue streaks across the papers spread before him, each page carrying a sketch of an idea, a name of someone who could help, or a note about resources his foundation already had in place. He had built his career on structuring large-scale projects, but this felt different. This was intimate, direct, and required a kind of precision that went beyond budgets and timelines. He kept thinking of Sophie in that dress, of the way she had straightened her back when he asked her to dance, and of Megan's quiet resilience. The connection to Grace's stitching wasn't just sentimental, it felt like a responsibility he had inherited the moment he recognized her work. By midday, his assistant had already made discreet phone calls to a handful of contacts. Michael wanted to move quietly, without creating the kind of public spectacle that would embarrass the Carters or turn them into a charity headline. He reached out to a children's arts program he had funded in the past and arranged for Sophie to receive a scholarship for private dance lessons. But not just any lessons, he specifically requested Ava Brooks, a choreographer he trusted, known for her rare ability to teach children to express emotion through movement rather than just perfecting steps. He believed that someone like Ava could give Sophie not only skill but also confidence, the kind that wouldn't depend on her dress, her background, or the approval of her classmates. At the same time, he contacted a clinic specializing in Megan's illness, one with a treatment plan that could be covered entirely through his foundation. He arranged for a home nurse to visit during the most demanding stages of recovery so that Megan could focus on getting better without worrying about who would care for Sophie. For her dignity, he ensured that all of this would be framed not as a personal favor but as a part of a broader community initiative. He understood the pride in Megan's eyes and the way she chose her words carefully to avoid sounding as if she were asking for help. He wanted her to feel supported without feeling indebted. The dress itself remained on his mind. He called a restoration workshop that specialized in preserving garments with personal history, asking them to examine it closely, repair the structural wear, and enhance its character without erasing its past. "I want the holes preserved," he instructed the seamstress over the phone, "but I want them framed with embroidery so they look intentional, part of the story. And the stains, turn them into flowers, but keep the original bird stitches exactly as they are. Those must remain untouched." The seamstress paused, clearly intrigued, before agreeing to take the project. Michael arranged for the dress to be collected discreetly, promising Sophie would have it back in time for the spring performance at her school. He also reached out to the principal, suggesting a new school program he would fund entirely, called Grace's Birdies in honor of his sister. It would provide free music and dance classes, as well as a costume library made from donated and restored clothing, so that no child would feel excluded from school performances or events for lack of something new. He explained that the point wasn't to erase the fact that some children came from harder circumstances, but to make sure that difference never became a source of humiliation. The principal, though surprised, welcomed the idea enthusiastically. In the days that followed, every detail began to fall into place. The clinic confirmed Megan's first treatment dates, Ava cleared her schedule to take on Sophie as a student, and the workshop sent updates on the dress, describing the delicate embroidery they had begun to weave into its worn spots. Michael kept most of the progress to himself, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he preferred to deliver everything at once rather than in fragments. He wanted Megan and Sophie to feel, in one moment, that their lives had shifted from a place of quiet endurance to one of steady possibility. Late one evening, after all the calls were made and the plans were in motion, Michael sat in his office with the lights dimmed. He held a small box in his hands, one he had kept for years. Inside was a scrap of fabric from one of the last dresses Grace had ever made, with a single bird stitched into its center. He thought about how she had insisted that every child deserved to be seen, that a piece of clothing could carry hope if someone put enough care into making it. Looking back, he realized he had built much of his life's work on that philosophy without even naming it. Now, with Sophie, the connection was tangible. For the first time in years, he felt that his work was about to intersect perfectly with his heart, and that this time, the impact would be something he could watch grow every step of the way. Sophie's first lesson with Ava Brooks took place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the city seemed to fold in on itself under a gray sky. The small dance studio smelled faintly of wood polish and lavender, with mirrors lining one wall and a row of worn ballet bars stretching across the length of the room. Sophie stood near the doorway at first, her yellow raincoat dripping onto the mat, clutching a pair of ballet slippers that were clearly secondhand but clean and neatly tied together with ribbon. Ava, tall and graceful with a calm energy that filled the space, crouched down to meet Sophie's eyes. She didn't immediately ask her to dance. Instead, she asked her about her favorite colors, her favorite song, and what she thought dancing was supposed to feel like. Sophie, a little shy but curious, answered that maybe dancing should feel like when you forget you're being watched. Ava smiled and told her that was exactly what they would work on. They began simply, with breathing. Ava taught her to stand still, feet grounded, shoulders loose, and to draw air in slowly through her nose, letting it fill her ribs. Before you take a single step, you have to give your body permission to move, Ava explained, demonstrating how breath could lead into motion. Sophie followed, her movements tentative at first, but Ava encouraged her with small nods and gentle corrections. Gradually, they shifted to walking in rhythm with the soft piano music playing in the background, then to lifting her arms in arcs that matched the rise and fall of the melody. The lesson wasn't about perfect positions or memorizing choreography, it was about finding a way to let movement feel natural, like an extension of herself rather than something she was performing for others. Meanwhile, Megan watched from a bench along the side wall, her hands resting in her lap, the fatigue in her face softened by pride. This was the first time in months she had been able to leave the apartment for something that wasn't a medical appointment, and she soaked in every detail, the way Sophie's hair brushed her cheeks when she turned, the way her feet began to find the floor with a little more certainty. Michael arrived halfway through the session, slipping in quietly so as not to interrupt. He stood near the back, hands in his pockets, watching as Sophie's steps grew more confident. He noticed that every time she caught her reflection in the mirror, she hesitated just slightly before continuing, as if still unsure that the girl she saw was capable of what she was doing. By the end of the hour, Ava asked Sophie to improvise to a short piece of music. At first, Sophie froze, glancing toward her mother, then toward Michael, and finally at the floor. Ava reassured her that there were no wrong steps, only moments to fill. Slowly, Sophie began to move, tentatively at first, then with small bursts of certainty. She twirled once, almost tripping, but kept going, letting the rhythm carry her. When the music ended, her cheeks were flushed, and her breathing was heavy, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there when she walked in. After class, Ava pulled Michael aside and told him that Sophie had potential, not necessarily to be a professional dancer, but to find her own strength through movement. It's not about talent, it's about her realizing she belongs in the space she takes up, Ava said. Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. On the way home, Sophie clutched her slippers in her lap and talked animatedly to her mother about the exercises, mimicking Ava's instructions and even correcting her own posture mid-sentence. Megan listened, smiling more than she had in weeks. That night, as Sophie drifted off to sleep, the pink dress lay folded on a chair nearby, still at the workshop but temporarily replaced with something simple for practice. She had started to ask when it would come back, not out of impatience, but because she now imagined wearing it on a stage where she could dance without worrying who was watching. Michael, sitting in his car outside their building before driving home, thought about how quickly the shifts were happening, not dramatic changes, but quiet ones, the kind that built a foundation. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Sophie had taken a step onto it with her head held just a little higher. The spring performance had been marked on the school calendar for months, but for Sophie, the days leading up to it seemed to move in two directions at once, racing forward whenever she thought about the music and the steps she had learned, and dragging painfully slow whenever her mind wandered to the memory of the last school event, when she had been left standing against the wall. The difference this time was that she wasn't facing it alone. Every week, she had gone to her lessons with Ava, practicing not only the movements but also the stillness between them, the moments where she could breathe and remember that she deserved to be seen. Megan had grown stronger, her treatment giving her enough energy to be more present, and the house felt lighter without the constant shadow of worry. The dress had been returned from the workshop just a week before the performance. Sophie had opened the package with the kind of reverence usually reserved for treasures. The fabric, though still unmistakably the same faded pink, now carried new life. The worn holes had been framed with delicate stitches, small flowers in soft tones that seemed to bloom naturally out of the imperfections. The faint stains had been transformed into gentle rose patterns that blended seamlessly with the rest of the fabric. But the bird embroidery, the one Grace had stitched, remained exactly as it had been, untouched except for the preservation of its thread. There were even a few new birds added around it, as if a flock had gathered to keep the original company. Sophie ran her fingers over each one, smiling in a way Michael hadn't seen before, as if she now understood the dress wasn't something to hide but something that told a story worth showing. The night of the performance, the auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and classmates. The stage lights, still dim, cast a warm glow over the curtain, and the low murmur of the crowd rose and fell like an unsettled tide. Backstage, Sophie stood in line with the other performers, her dress gently swaying as she shifted from foot to foot. She could hear the muffled voice of the principal introducing the program, followed by applause. Some of the children glanced at her dress and then quickly away, as if unsure what to make of it now that it no longer fit neatly into the category of old or new. When her turn came, Sophie stepped out into the lights. The music began with a soft, steady pulse, and she remembered Ava's first lesson: stand still, breathe, let the air give you permission to move. She let the breath fill her ribs, then took her first step. It was not the hurried, self-conscious movement of someone rushing to finish, but the deliberate start of a story she had decided to tell. She moved through the space with a mixture of grace and honesty, her small hands lifting and turning in arcs that matched the melody. When she twirled, the dress caught the light in such a way that every stitch, every bird, and every flower seemed to be part of the choreography. In the front row, Megan sat with her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Michael was beside her, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know how much this moment meant to him. He noticed the way Sophie's shoulders were no longer drawn tight, the way she filled the stage without shrinking back. He also noticed something else: the audience was leaning forward, not out of pity, but out of genuine interest. They weren't seeing a girl in an old dress, they were seeing a performance that had its own quiet power. As the music built to its final notes, Sophie lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the crowd for the first time that evening. There was no hesitation now. The last step landed with a stillness that seemed to hold the entire room in place for a heartbeat before the applause began. It started with a few claps, then swelled into something louder, fuller. Sophie gave a small bow, her dress fluttering, and walked off stage with the calm satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what she came to do. Back in the wings, Ava knelt down and told her she had danced beautifully, not because every step was perfect, but because she had let the story of her movement be honest. Megan hugged her tightly, and Michael, who had been waiting quietly for his turn, placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You looked like you belonged up there," he said, his voice low but steady. Sophie didn't need to answer, the way she smiled and stood just a little taller was enough. The performance was over, but the shift it had created, both in how she saw herself and how others saw her, was only beginning. In the weeks following the performance, the changes in Sophie's life became part of her daily rhythm rather than extraordinary events. At school, she no longer lingered at the edges of the playground waiting for others to decide if she could join. She began to walk into groups with a quiet confidence that surprised her classmates, who had once dismissed her without a thought. Some of them, the same children who had laughed at her dress months before, now asked her questions about the dance and even about the embroidery, curious about where it came from. Sophie didn't brag or tell the whole story, she simply said that every stitch had a meaning, and if they wanted to understand it, they would have to watch closely. That mystery seemed to give her a presence she had never had before. The Grace's Birdies program that Michael had proposed officially launched at the school. Boxes of donated clothing arrived weekly, not to be given away as charity handouts, but to be transformed in the small sewing room the school had converted for the purpose. The room buzzed with the sound of sewing machines, the snip of scissors, and the hum of children learning to mend and decorate their own pieces. Sophie often visited the workshop, helping younger students pick fabric for patches or showing them how to thread a needle, skills Ava had encouraged as part of her dance training to build patience and focus. Teachers noticed that the children who once would have teased others for wearing something old were now proudly wearing altered pieces with stories stitched into them. At home, Megan's health continued to improve. The treatments arranged through Michael's foundation were working, and though recovery was slow, she could now walk Sophie to school some mornings and even cook dinner without needing to rest halfway through. Their apartment began to feel different, not because it had changed physically, but because the weight that had hung over it for so long was lifting. There was laughter at the table again, and the sound of Sophie practicing her dance steps in the small living room filled the space where silence had once been. Michael remained involved but never in a way that drew attention to himself. Sometimes he appeared at Sophie's dance rehearsals, standing quietly in the back until she noticed him, her face lighting up at the sight. Other times, he met with the principal to discuss expanding the program to other schools, using Sophie's story as an example of what could happen when a child was given not just help, but dignity. He didn't tell the public about the personal connection to the dress. That part remained between him, Megan, and Sophie, a private thread woven into their shared history. One afternoon, as the school year drew to a close, the principal invited the community to a small ceremony in the auditorium. At the front of the room, mounted in a simple glass case, was Sophie's pink dress. The plaque beneath it read, "The dress that danced, a gift to the school so no child is ashamed of where they begin." The case stood not as a relic of poverty, but as a testament to transformation. Every imperfection was still visible, every flower and bird preserved, telling the story without shame. Sophie stood beside it for a moment after the ceremony ended, tracing the glass with her fingertips, and whispered to herself, "The birdies are still here." That evening, she danced again, not on a stage, but in the small living room, her bare feet sliding across the floor as Megan watched from the couch and Michael sat at the table, a quiet smile on his face. There was no audience, no applause, just the rhythm of her movement and the warmth of being surrounded by people who believed in her. She spun once, let the momentum slow, and stood still, breathing the way Ava had taught her. In that stillness, she realized she no longer danced to prove she belonged, she danced because she knew she did. The life she and her mother were building was still modest, still simple, but it was theirs, and it was growing stronger with every step. And somewhere, she thought, Grace's birdies were flying higher than ever. To me, the ending of this story is powerful because it transforms what began as a small act of kindness into a lasting change in the lives of everyone involved. It's not just about Sophie overcoming the humiliation of that night or learning to dance with confidence, it's about dignity, connection, and the quiet strength that grows when someone chooses to truly see you. Michael's gesture went far beyond a single evening. He didn't swoop in as a savior and disappear, he built a bridge that Sophie and Megan could walk across toward a better future. What I love most is that the pink dress, once a symbol of shame in the eyes of others, became a celebrated emblem of resilience and beauty. It shows that the very things people might mock can, with care and meaning, become a source of pride. And the fact that the dress carried the legacy of Michael's sister adds a layer of fate to the story, almost as if life was giving him a second chance to honor her kindness. The happy ending works because it's not perfect. Sophie's life isn't suddenly free of challenges, but the foundation for her future has been transformed. She has confidence, community, and the knowledge that she is worthy, not because of her clothes, but because of who she is. That's a lesson worth dancing for.